Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second in the series where we're going to have a look at inland oil spills or responding to incidents and impacts into rivers, lakes, and estuaries. So following on from the last webinar that I gave a month ago, I had a lot of questions come in saying, yeah, it all sounds very good. It's all very high level. But what we really need to understand is how we go about selecting what response strategy we're going to use, what equipment we need, and what kind of resources we need available when we're thinking about minimizing the impact to the environment from our operations. So in a slight change to our planned webinar today, I want to take a step back slightly and talk about the net environmental benefit analysis or spill impact mitigation assessment tools that we use within OSRL, that when we go and see clients and do things like capability reviews, where we look at their operations, at their response structure, and see if one is capable of dealing with an incident from the other. It's a standard procedure that we look at to make sure that the right resources are available, depending obviously on the environment that you face. So I just want to check if I can get a thumbs up from people that you can see my screen, and you should see the opening slide. There's no thumbs up. There is a thumbs up. Okay, good. So at least one person's listening. Thank you, Ines. Okay, so guys, what I want you to think about, thank you, Aline. What I want you to think about is I'm going to throw a lot of information at you over the next 45 minutes. But one of the strengths of All Spill Response is we've been in business now for 40 years. So we've been doing this a long time. And I've been there for almost half of it myself. So if you have an operation or a situation that you want help and advice on, you can call us or email us, and my contact details are available as you signed up for this webinar. You can also go on our website and pose us the question. Because I know at first glance, this assessment tool looks quite complicated. But when you have somebody there walking you through it, it's actually quite straightforward, and it gives you a really good result about what it is that you want to achieve and how you can go and achieve it. Okay, so that's probably enough introduction now. So let's get on with our presentation. So you will hear two terminologies. You'll hear NEBA, most commonly, and then SIMA. So SIMA is the Spill Impact Mitigation Assessment. So actually, this is a new way of developing this response strategy selection. But the process, the basic principles haven't changed. So we still follow the process of assessing what our risks are, what our goals are. So when we're looking at things, we still do the same things. We evaluate the data. So we identify these resources at risk. What is important to us? And I know when we're thinking about resources at risk, people think, oh, you know, it's mangroves or swamps, but it can also be commercial resources at risk. If you think one of the aims of our oil spill response operations is to get us back to normal running as quickly as possible, because no business can afford to wait and go idle for days, weeks, months while they're responding to an incident. So when we're looking at resources, that's one of the things that we have to think about. And then we're predicting outcomes. What's the worst that can happen here? Because unless we identify what the worst situation is that we could be facing, how could we prepare for it? There's nothing worse than getting caught out by a situation. So this is an opportunity to us to all sit in a group and think, okay, what's the worst thing that can happen to us here? And if that does happen, how will we respond to it? Because the reason that we choose the worst case is that if something happens and it's less than the worst case, well, then we're already over prepared, which is excellent. Okay. And then we're going to balance trade-offs. As you know, as I'm sure you're all aware, there is no silver bullet when it comes to oil spill response. There is nothing that we can choose, no one single strategy, no one single response technique that will deal completely with the incident that we face, even small incidents. So there's a trade-off that we use. So what's the best thing that we have? And then what can we do to support the bits that that response technique doesn't cover? Once we've identified the best response technique, then we can think about, okay, so how do we make this response technique as efficient and effective as possible? So, for example, it could be that we're going to decide that we need to dam a particular stream or drain and prevent that oil spreading into the river. Sounds great. So if we're going to choose that response strategy, we have to think it's all very well having the damming resources, but we want to think about the people. We want to think about the access. We want to think about the time that it would take to move the resources from where they are to where they're needed. So this is the basic principles. And although it sounds like quite complex, it's actually only 4 stages. The first stage is obviously gathering and evaluating the data. And the 5 areas there, defining the scenario. So what could happen in our operations that will cause us to spill oil? Easy. We can walk around our operations as they stand now and have a look and see what actions and operations we undertake and identify, ooh, if this goes wrong, this will happen. Once we start doing that, the next bit just falls into place, that incident and oil information. What products are we using? What volumes pass through our operations? How long for? Are we running 24 hours a day? Or are we just loading vessels once or twice a month? And then the times of the year, the different seasons. I know here in Texas, it vastly differs from January time all the way through to June time. January, we could be in freezing temperatures, and in June time, we could be 45 degrees Celsius or 110 Fahrenheit for those of you that work on that scale. So there's a vast difference that would impact our response to the incident based upon when we spill it. And then this oil freight and transport. Where is the oil going to go? Now, there's some great computer-generated models for offshore oil spills. But when we're looking at inland oil spills, there's so many variables from ground type, from topography, slope, if it's raining, if it hasn't been raining. So this is where we have to get physically out in the field and look and assess and see where the drains are, see where the hard standing areas are, see what's happened before. Go and stand out in the rain when it's raining. Obviously put your coat on first and see where the water's flowing from your area. Because if the water's flowing in a certain direction, the oil will flow there too. So once we have an understanding of what incident could cause an oil spill, what type of product we could spill, where it's going to go, we need to see what things it's going to impact on its route. And this could be, if it's just a small area around our facility, how is it going to impact our facility? How is it going to stop us doing the work that we need to do? Or if it leaves our facility, what is it going to impact? What is around us? Are people living in houses around us? Is there a wildlife park? Is there a beach or a tourist area? So we have to look outside of our fence lines and see what is around us. Because as we know, oil spills, by their very nature, don't just stay in one location. They move, which makes them so difficult to respond to, which is why we go through this planning process. So once we've understood those 4 areas, now we can start thinking about the potential response options. And one thing I will say here, one thing I'd really like to stress here, is that we're looking to keep it as simple as possible. There are some wonderful techniques out on the market now that are cutting edge, but without the right logistical support, without the right technical experts, they are going to take so long to actually put in place. Whereas things like sorbent boom materials, things like our simple river boom, are quick and easy to deploy. And that's one of the things that we want to think about. What is the first strike method that we can use? And then we can build upon that. Once we've got our first layer in, we can then get more complex, get more effective, get more efficient. But we have to do something first. So when we're looking at our potential response options, we think about what is the easiest and quickest thing for us to do. And this could be things like deploying sorbent booms, putting drain covers over drainage areas, making sure that all sluice gates or drain valves are closed. So we want to think simple things first, then as the response progresses, we get more complicated. So one of the things that we have to do that's very, very important is this risk assessment to find your worst case oil spill scenario. And again, a simple 4-step process that OSRL are available to assist you with. First of all, identify hazards, operational hazards. What are you actually doing at your facility? Environmental factors. Where are you located? What is around you? Are you, like our Fort Lauderdale response base, are you impacted by hurricanes at certain times of the year? What will that mean to your response? And then the oil type. I'm sure the people on this call are very aware that there's a huge difference between responding to a spill of light products such as gasoline to responding to a product of asphalt. Everybody can picture that, the difference. So we need to understand what the product is that we are dealing with. And this is especially relevant when we're looking at some of the newer fuels, the low sulfur fuels, because some of those require specific changes in how we're physically responding, how we're protecting our response personnel. And then the probability. And again, after being in business 40 years, this is where OSRL can really help you gather this data. We know the incidents that have occurred. historically within the oil and gas industry and outside of the oil and gas industry as well. And we have reports from all of the responses that we've been on that look and analyze those incidents, what worked well, what didn't work well, what was the cause of the incident. We use those to make sure that we gather either the data-driven or observational analysis. So depending on your location, if it's in an area where the oil and gas industry has been going for many, many years, such as Trinidad. So Trinidad has great data-driven analysis information. So you can call upon the government and the regulators, and they will provide you with this information. But then there's the newer areas, such as Guyana. So Guyana hasn't got a long history of oil and gas operations. So we just use the observational analysis so we can look at the operation that's being carried out, at the mitigation methods already in place, and from that, we can work out what the probability of an incident happening is. Once we've got those two pieces of information, we can then assign it a likelihood value. What is the chance of this incident actually occurring? And there are so many factors that go to play in this, that we look at not only the operation, not only the history, but also things like the training of the personnel. Following COVID back in 2020 to 2021, a lot of operations went down to a skeleton staff and ran very slowly. So a lot of the more experienced personnel left the oil and gas industry and went to work in other businesses. So when they started back up again and they took on new staff, that experience wasn't there anymore. And what we saw at All Spill Response was an actual increase in the amount of incidents because there wasn't that historical knowledge in the industry anymore or in this particular organization. So we were able to track that. So it's not just, it's this operation. It's not just this product that we're dealing with. It's also the people we're working alongside. And then obviously we need to determine the consequences. So what's the amount of oil that could be spilt? What's the impact that we could or could result of this incident? And from that, we can give it a severity classification. Is this a minor incident? You know, it can be dealt with within a couple of hours. Is it a moderate impact where there could be a day or two's closure of our operation? Or is it a severe impact where there's some major damage, where the unit that we're working in could be out for weeks, possibly months, and need a major amount of investment to bring back online? And then last but not least, obviously, there's the environmental and sensitivities. So if you think when we spill oil on the ground, it moves a lot slower than if we were to spill it on a river, a fast-flowing river, on a lake, or obviously into the sea itself. So we want to prevent that oil reaching these areas. Once we identify where we need to protect, we obviously then look at our response capability, the equipment and the people. So moving on, looking at the incident and gathering the oil information. So one of the things that we can do is on all of our sites, we've got safety data sheets, SDS sheets. And if you pick up those SDS sheets, you'll be able to see some basic information in there about the products that you are dealing with. It will give you some guidance on what will happen to that oil once it's spilt in the environment, and also what PPE responders will need to wear to keep them safe if they are part of our emergency response team. So that's a really good first place to start. And then with incident information, as we talked about in the previous slide, we can look historically, what has happened at this location before, or what's happened at other locations that carry out similar operations to us. And again, OSRL are a great resource for this. And I fully encourage you to reach out, talk to one of our duty managers, talk to one of our solutions advisors about what we have experienced at other facilities. And then there's the resources at risk, and looking at what sensitivities, both environmental sensitivities and also economic sensitivities, are around us. And when we look at worst case scenarios, we look at what major impact our incident could have on others, because then that will direct our response priorities. What is important to us? What do we need to focus on in those early stages of the response? Then, of course, that will drive our potential response operations. So what are we going to do? And look, you can see in that picture on the slide now, they've decided that there is fuel leaking out of this sunken yacht, and their response option is to contain that oil, prevent it from spreading, prevent it from impacting the other yachts or operations in the marina. So our response operation, very simple. We're trying to keep it as simple and as straightforward as possible, trying to minimize any damage that our incident could have, not only on the environment, not only on the resources around us, but also on our own operation. Because we want to bring the impact to our operation down to a minimum level. So how do we do that? So we do that using the 3 stages of response operations. And again, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know or could guess. So obviously, the first stage, the incident's happening. So what we are focusing on doing is to prevent that impact from getting any worse. So we do that by focusing on the removal, or at least the containment of as much of that oil that has been spilt as possible. We also want to keep the amount of additional debris down to an absolute minimum. So if possible, we do a pre-clean of the location, which is why it's so important that we do housekeeping in our site. It's why it's important that we pick up the bottles, we pick up the rags, because if there is an incident, all of a sudden they go from being a nuisance to now being hazardous waste that we need to treat. So we want to make sure that we prevent any incident from becoming worse. So we limit that impact. Now, stage 2, obviously, we've now prevented that incident from spreading, from getting any worse. So this is where we're looking at cleaning any trapped oil, minimizing the damage that is occurring in the area where we've contained that oil. Obviously, this is quite time sensitive. So stage 1 really is your first operational period, depending obviously on the quantity of oil that's been spilt. Stage 2 is your second, third, fourth, however long it takes operational period. This is when we're removing the oil. We're trying to prevent it, as it says there, soaking into the ground and into even potentially the water column. One of the good things that I've seen being used on many responses is this low pressure flushing, where we use fresh water to mobilize that stuck oil into a particular area where we can skim it, where we can use vacuum trucks, or where we can use sorbent material to recover. And then last but not least, obviously, this is stage 3. This is the last stage, the final polish of the area. This is where we're looking to get the impacted area back to how it was before the spill happened. And that brings up a really good point. How do we know what we are aiming for if we've not kept records on what was in this area prior to the incident? So as part of our assessment process, as part of our planning process, we need to look at the environment around us or the commercial activities around us and see what level of cleanliness, what level of operational efficiency do they currently have? Because we want to get back to that stage. So when we're looking at selecting our response methods, there's a number of things that we can do, but it's based upon some very clear guidelines. First, the oil type that we're dealing with. As we've spoken about before, we're going to respond very differently to a spill of gasoline as we would to a spill of asphalt and everything in between. Obviously, the environment that we're working in, that will direct how easy is it for us to get our response resources into the area that's needed. The all part built into that is the safety. We don't want to put any of our responders in any danger. So we need to make sure that we have a broad and very good overview of the safety of our personnel on site. Next, obviously, is the degree of oiling. As we spoke about in our response stages, that first operational period, we're going to focus on the areas of heavy oiling. So, or how are we going to respond to those? The sensitivities, what are we trying to protect? Are they the environmental sensitivities, the mangroves, the swamps, the bird nesting areas, the turtle nesting beaches? Or are they commercial sensitivities, ports, harbours, marinas, water intakes? This is where our NEBA comes in. So our pre-planning that we've done. This is where we can look at that and say, okay, for this particular area, we've decided that containment is our first operational period, or our first operational activity, should I say. So if we know that we're going to contain, then we need to decide how we're going to contain. And that all ties into the cost benefit. We want to make sure that what we're doing is as efficient as possible. And all of these steps, all 7 of these steps, can actually be done during the planning process. This is not something you want to think about once the incident has happened. We need to do this as part of our planning process. So let's have a look at some of the ways that we can respond to oil spills. The first one, obviously, is no intervention. This is where we are not physically moving any resources from our stockpile to that area. What we are doing, though, is we are monitoring those contaminated areas because we've made assumptions. For example, for a gasoline spill, we've made assumptions that a certain percentage of that gasoline will evaporate over a certain period of time. We need to make sure that what we've assumed will happen is actually happening. So that monitoring of the contaminated area all the time. Obviously, we want to make sure that the area that this action is taken is being monitored and isolated. We don't want any people going into that area while these operations are going on. So there's a number of areas where this is a very, very good response strategy, as it says there. When natural removal rates are fast, so very light products, aviation fuel, naphtha, those type of products work very well for this natural recovery. They evaporate quickly, or if it's a high energy area where there's a lot of movement, we can introduce a lot of movement into the water. Also, there are some areas that it's so logistically difficult for us to get to that actually trying to get to that area will cause more harm than benefit. So that's where we want to look at. We need to look at also the biological constraints. So what sensitivities in the area are we going to start disrupting the birds, the marine mammals, endangered species? Is there some way that we can prevent them going into that area in the first place? So, natural recovery. It's not simple as just leave it alone, obviously. We have to monitor it. We have to make sure that our assumptions are correct. Then the next one that we have is sorbent material. So sorbent material, I'm sure everybody's aware of sorbent material. Again, a very, very good first strike response method. It does say there that when to use, the selection varies by oil type. Heavy oils need high surface area sorbents, lighter oils penetrate sorbents. So as I'm sure you're all aware, sorbent materials act like a sponge. So they soak in the product. So they're very good on the lighter products. An important point to note, though, is if your product that you're recovering is flammable, even when it's absorbed into sorbent material, it remains flammable. I was on a response once where it was a relatively small response. It was on a hard standing area. There was no major environmental impacts. It was contained. But it was decided that we were going to use sorbent material to recover the product. And it was a gasoline derivative. So they used granular sorbent, they used the boom sorbent to create barriers, and they put all this material down. We left it an hour, monitored it for an hour or so, and then they recovered all this material with plastic shovels and brooms, all the tools that would not create a spark, the intrinsically safe tools. They recovered this product and they put all the waste they recovered into black plastic bags with the tops of those bags tied off. And then they left those bags to be recovered by the waste contractor later that day. But these bags were left out in the sun. So you have to think, how hot does it get in a black plastic bag out in the sun when there's materials in there that are gassing off and vaporizing quickly? So basically what we'd managed to make was small Molotov cocktails that if the bag had been punctured at any time, these highly flammable vapors would have come out. And when the waste contractor came, he was just in a regular truck, a gas-powered truck. So if any of those vapors had come out of those bags, made their way into the engine, that was a real source, ignition source, a real risk that you have to think about. So sorbent material, again, you have to realize that just because the product has gone doesn't make it any less flammable or dangerous. When you're using absorbent material for heavier products, obviously you don't get that absorption. You get coating. So they still work to a certain extent, but they're just not as efficient. Now, if we've got nothing else that we can use, using sorbent materials better than not doing anything. But one of the things that we have to think about is the amount of waste that's generated. As a general rule of thumb, absorbent materials will absorb half of their volume for a light product. But when we're looking at the heavier products, that goes down to 10%. So from 50% to 10%, which it means we're going to create 5 times as much waste and use 5 times as much sorbent materials. And if any of you have had to go out and buy sorbent materials recently, you'll know that the price currently is, well, sorbent. It's gone up a lot. So we want to make sure that when we use sorbents, we know they're a great first strike response tool. But if we're using them for heavier products, they are just that, our first strike response. We want to do something else on top of that, so we don't keep using all these sorbent materials inefficiently. So when we're looking at what can we do, it's booms. So these are the yellow, the orange, the black, either inflatable, permanent inflation booms, but some type of barrier that can go in rivers, in lakes, in estuaries, that will, as it says on the slide there, hold and concentrate the oil ready for removal. We can either push it away from our sensitive sites, or we can direct the oil into our recovery area. They're also very, very useful for protecting water intakes, for example, for certain sensitive areas. Entries into marinas is another good use for these booms. On a number of drills, exercises, and actual responses that I've been on, one of the main problems that I've seen is where the boom goes to the bank of the river, of the lake, of the estuary. And the bottom of our typical boom, once it starts impacting the riverbed bed, will then become entangled and the oil will go past there. So there are a number of ways that we can prevent this happening. Obviously, the simple way is using sandbags and sorbent material to get out to the depth where the boom then becomes effective. There are specialist shore sealing booms. So these are booms that have an air chamber on the top and water chambers on the bottom that float when the water is deep enough, but sink and seal against whatever ground that they are resting on to make sure that there's not that gap where the oil can escape. But booming, very good. Obviously, skimming. There's a number of skimmers available on the market. And when we're thinking about how we recover oil, one of the things we want to think about is how are we going to get the skimmer to where it's needed? Do we need to manually move it to that area? Then we're thinking about a light skimmer. How long do we have for that skimmer to work? So again, it's a great strategy. There's just certain logistical constraints that we need to think about before we can deploy it. And then there's good old manual oil removal. So this is the rakes, the shovels, the squeegees. Can be very, very effective. But obviously, it's people and resource heavy. Not only are we putting our responders into the direct contact with the product, we also need a lot of people to carry out these type of tasks. If we just have our regular team of 6 or 8 responders, they are going to be all caught up on this activity. So for larger incidents, we need to think about where additional people are going to come from. We spoke about cleaning with water earlier, the low pressure flushing. Again, a very, very effective way of moving the oil out of an area that's been impacted and into an area where we can collect it. Depending on the environment, we can obviously go for hot water or high pressure cleaning or even steam cleaning. But obviously, we want to use these in our hard standing operational areas as part of that final cleaning process. There's also shoreline cleaning with chemicals. So this is where we use additional chemicals on top of our water cleaning. So detergents, for example, that will help soften and lift heavy weathered oils. So those asphalts that I spoke about earlier. There are chemicals that we can add to the water. They are very effective. However, one of the things that we need to remember is we are basically adding another element into the environment. And in many, many countries around the world, we need permission to use these type of chemicals. So as part of your planning process, your NEBA SIMA process, this is where we judge, do we need these chemicals? If so, how do we get approvals before we even need them? Obviously, in situ burning, again, can be very effective when used in the right way. If it's a tool that we can use, then we identify that, and in our planning process, we'll get the right permissions prior to us needing it. And the last thing we want to do with all of these methods of response is evaluate how effective it's been. Like I said, there's no silver bullet when it comes to response. What we want to think about is it doing what we assumed it would? Is there a better way of doing this? And like everything in oil spill response, we have a process for that, which we call SCAT. It's Shoreline Cleanup Assessment Technique. Even though it says shoreline, we can use it anywhere. And again, it's a process. And that process is split into two halves, the preparedness and the response. So in our planning, what we look at is we do a reconnaissance survey. This is before any incidents happened. We go and gather the data. It says there on point 2, segmenting shoreline. It doesn't have to be a shoreline. It can be the area that you've identified in your reconnaissance survey that could be impacted by an event. We want to divide those areas up into key areas. And as we've spoken about before, the key areas could be, this is a commercial area. This is an environmental sensitive area. This is a main transport route. This is an area where people live. So we divide these up into different areas, different zones, and then develop these spill-specific guidelines and endpoints. What are we aiming for when we start our response? What is our goal? Do we need to keep this main transport route open? Do we need to make sure that these water intakes are able to keep providing cooling water to the power generation plant? Those priorities, we use this to identify those priorities. Then based on that, we can say, okay, we've identified that these water intakes are priority. So in our pre-survey planning and team assignments, we can assign this particular team, this is your response equipment, this is what you need to do. And all that is part of the preparedness. But again, we've made assumptions. We've looked at what we think is going to happen. When the incident actually occurs, this is when we go and assess, is what we thought would happen actually happening? So this is when we do a survey, a post-incident survey. Is the oil going where we think it's going to go? But with the data that we collect, we want to make sure that we give that data to our management team or to the response team so they are aware. When they're developing, when they are doing the actual response, we want to make sure that what they're doing is being effective. Are we recovering the product as effectively as we could do? Are we putting people into danger? If we are, we know that we need to choose another response technique. Then, based upon our first reconnaissance survey, we can see how close are we getting to that during our response operations. So the post-cleanup inspection, we've got something that we can give either to ourselves if we're evaluating how clean it's getting, or to the assessors or the regulators to show this is what it was in the beginning, this is what it is now. And if we made the right decisions, we will then get a final sign-off of the cleanup activities. And that's what we're looking for. Okay, so like I said, I've thrown a lot of information at you over the past 47 minutes. But basically, the things that I want you to think about is we can use these tools to identify what the potential impact of any incident is, what level of resources that we need to have on site, where best we can use these resources, and then what we do if those resources, if those response techniques aren't working like we thought they would. We need to have a backup plan. And that's where this planning process really helps us. So the stages, the 4 stages, gathering the data, predicting the outcomes, choosing our response strategy, knowing what our primary response strategy is going to be, and then what our secondary response strategy is going to be if what we assume is going to happen doesn't happen. And we do this by putting a lot of energy into our preparedness activities. We identify the scenarios that we could face. This is where we look at the environmental and also the economic sensitivities of what response techniques could work for us. And this is the great thing about being in the preparedness area, is we get to try different things out. See what works, do some drills, do some exercises, test our assumptions. Once we've come up with what we think is the best plan, that's when we can promote our preparedness decisions to others. So if we need regulatory approval for the use of dispersants, for the use of chemicals, for shoreline cleanup, for in situ burning, if we have a good plan and we go to the regulators with this plan, we'll be able to explain to them, this is why we want to do what we're going to do. We also, during this area, get to share the knowledge that we have with others. And then during the response, we know that we have our trained team already experts in how we're going to respond. Built upon that, we also have OSRL, or you also have OSRL, that can come to your site through our technical advisor service or be available at the end of a telephone, who can provide that technical expertise, what's worked well in other areas that could be effective in your particular situation as well. But with all of these things, we need to make sure that we follow a process and keep records. We want to ensure that any incident that we face, any drill that we carry out, that these records are kept so we can learn lessons. Not only is it important we can learn lessons, but if we're responding to an incident where the financing for that incident will come from one of the international monetary funds, they will require detailed records about what you've done, why you did what you did, and what the result of those actions were before they'll pay out. So I can't, again, stress enough the importance of keeping records. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. I very, very much appreciate it. Again, I fully understand that I have thrown so much information at you over the past 50 minutes that you're probably all sat there slightly shell-shocked and not knowing where to start. So let me make this very, very simple for you. If you are working at an operation, or if you are faced with some kind of project that you're doing, or you have a concern about a particular aspect of the company, the business, the region that you work in, that you would like advice on, you can call All Spill Response. You can talk to one of our duty managers or technical experts, and you can get information about the best way to proceed, what we've done in other operations that may be similar to yours, what we've done in the region around you with other organizations. Over the past 40 years, we've been involved in hundreds of incidents. For each of those incidents, we've learned lessons. So we are a resource for you to call upon anytime you need us. And again, like I said, it seems like this NEBA SIMA process is very complex, but once you run through it a couple of times, it is in fact very straightforward. And right now, if you go to our website and you look in under the technical information, there is a SIMA, a Spill Impact Mitigation Assessment field guide that walks you through that process. It's even got a form in there that you can fill in as you follow those steps. And I fully encourage you to go to our website, download that. It's free, the SIMA field guide, and just run through the process. It might take a couple of attempts for you to get comfortable with it, but pretty soon you'll be able to see that it's a very, very useful tool when it comes to planning how we're going to respond to an oil spill incident. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time this morning. I really appreciate it. If